Got a little bit of a tickle in my throat for some reason, so if I end up coughing, I apologize. But again, I hope you're doing well, and welcome to the stream, or welcome, or thank you for watching the recording. If you happen to be watching the recording, um, I was actually going to start playing music. I want to sort of incrementally improve the stream as I continue to do this. And one of the things I was thinking about was starting to play some music, and there's a big kerfuffle, I guess, going on because of some restrictions that Twitch is putting on streamers regarding copyrighted music. So I don't think I'll be doing that. I'm going to maybe try to find some like copyright-free instrumental music, something like that, to play in the background. And it's fine. It's just nice to have that little bit of music going on behind the scenes as you go through the demos and that kind of stuff. So anyway, today's topic is working or basically building approval workflows using Power Automate. So Power Automate was formerly known as Microsoft Flow. I'm sure that throughout most of the stream I'll refer to it as Flow rather than Power Automate, just because that's what I'm used to. So the tool, the product is called Power Automate, and then the workflows or the automations you build with Power Automate are called flows. So maybe that's why, I think there's a couple of reasons why Microsoft decided to change the name. Power Automate is part of the Power Platform, which is Power Apps, Power BI, Power Automate, Power Virtual Agents. So they wanted a product name that started with the word power. And maybe there was a little bit of confusion between Flow, the product, and Flow, the things you build. Anyway, it's not really germane to the topic about building flows. So let's take a look at that. So first off, let me actually remember to share my screen this time, which I've forgotten to do the last couple times I've done streams. So here I have a SharePoint site with a list, and what we're gonna use this list as sort of the basis for the approval process. So when a user adds an item to this list, we want it to go through this approval process. There might be one approver, there might be two approvers, depending on a value in the list, and so on. So let's actually just go ahead and add an item. You can see it's a really simple list. So I can go click new here, and then there's a title. So I'll set this to item 1, and there's an amount. So I'll just put that as 100, and then click save. So there you can see that the item got added to the list. So there's the title, the amount. Notice there's also a couple additional columns here. So we have approval status and approval summary. We're going to use these to store information about the approval process. And then in addition, there is the created by user and created by date and time, and modified user and modified date and time. So if any of you happen to catch my session at the Galactic Collaboration Summit, that was on my session was played on Tuesday. This will look very familiar to you because this was exactly what I did during that session. So this Twitch stream will be an expanded version of the demo that I did in that session. So that session was only half an hour, so I couldn't cover everything I really wanted to cover. So I figured I'd just go through the same starting process again and then add to it stuff you didn't get a chance to see if you did happen to catch that session. All right, so now we've got our list. Let's actually create our flow. So to do that, I will go to the Flow or the Power Automate website, which you can find at flow.microsoft.com. And if you aren't signed in, there'll be a sign-in icon here or sign-in link here at the top. You can click that and then sign in. So I already have signed in. And if you notice that the URL has switched to canada.flow.microsoft.com. So the first time you visit the Flow website and you sign in, excuse me, it'll ask you where are you located. So I'm in Canada, so I chose that. So it goes to Canada.flow.microsoft.com. So I guess really depending on what region you're in, you'll go to different websites, but that doesn't affect your ability to use or share your flows with your organization. All right, so now that I'm in the website, I want to build a flow. And there's a few ways to do this. Let's do this by clicking the Create link over here in the left-hand navigation. And there's a few different types of flows. So here we can see 3 of them. We have the automated flow, the instant flow, and the scheduled flow. So an instant flow, which is also known as a button flow, is a flow that's manually triggered or explicitly triggered by a user. So the user says, I want to run this particular flow right now. And it's called the button flow because you can actually run these kinds of flows from the Flow mobile app that you can get on your tablet or on your phone by, excuse me, not surprisingly, clicking a button. A scheduled flow, as the name suggests, is a flow that runs on a timer. And then there's an automated flow, which is probably the most common kind of flow, which runs on a specific event happening. So that could be that a tweet with a certain text got sent out, or you received an email from a certain user, or an item got added into a SharePoint list. There's lots of different kinds of what we call triggers that can make a flow happen. Okay, so I'm going to do an automated flow. So here it's going to ask us what's the flow name. So I'll just call this approval demo. And then what's going to trigger the flow? So every single flow has a single trigger. That's what makes the flow happen. So for a manual flow, it's the user explicitly starting the flow. For a scheduled flow, it's whatever the time interval that you've set has elapsed. And then for an automated flow, it is some action or some process happened inside of one of the connectors. Okay, so the connector we're going to choose is SharePoint. And what I want to do is when an item is created. So this will run when an item is created in a list. Let's see if it's showing here. No, there's another option you can do, which I'll show you in a second, which is for a selected item. Okay, so I'll talk about that in just a second here. But the one we want is when an item is created. Okay, so let me go ahead and click Create here. So here is the start part, or the sort of scaffolding of our flow. Okay. Now I mentioned connectors. Let's just do a Google search or a Bing search for flow connectors. So this is flow.microsoft.com/connectors, and you can see that there are lots of them. There's over 200 different connectors, and you can connect to services, cloud services that are published by Microsoft, like Exchange Online, OneDrive, SharePoint, Azure, Flow itself. There's a Flow management connector, the Common Data Service, Microsoft Forms is another one, Planner. So lots of different stuff from Microsoft or from non-Microsoft vendors. So you can see there's Twitter there. You can connect to Salesforce. You can connect to ServiceNow. You can connect to some of the Google services like Google Drive, and so on. Okay. And if you notice, some of these connectors are marked as premium. So for example, over here, the Common Data Service is marked as a premium connector. Right? So what that means is that depending on how that connector is used, well, definitely the author of the flow. Again, excuse me for I just got something in my throat here. Definitely the author of the flow will need to have a premium license to use that connector. And depending on how that connector is used, the users who consume that flow might also need to have a premium license. Okay, the ones that are marked without the premium identifier can be used by, like, if, for example, any Office 365 user can use those without having to have any kind of special license other than Office 365 itself. Okay, so I'm going to talk about connectors, and connectors expose triggers, which we've talked about, right? So again, over here, this is my trigger. This is what's going to make the flow happen or the flow run. And then there's only ever one of them in an individual flow. And then we have these things called actions. So actions also come from connectors. All right, so this is our trigger. So when an item is created in a SharePoint list, so what we're going to do is specify what site does the list live in. So I'll just go ahead and drop this down, and it's this site here. And if for some reason this doesn't show up, sometimes it doesn't, especially when you first start using Flow, you can go ahead and click Enter a Custom Value, and then just copy and paste the URL to your SharePoint site into the box here. But since I have it available in the dropdown, I'll just go ahead and use that. And then which list? So it's Approval Demo is the name of the list. So I'll go ahead and choose Approval Demo. So that's our trigger now configured. When an item is created in that list, this flow will run. And to be able to save, so we have a save option up here in the top right. And there's also a save option here below, excuse me, in our designer. But in order to save, I need to add at least one action. So to add an action, and this really should say new action rather than new step. But when the designer was originally created, it was the button was just called new step, so they left it there. But I'll go ahead and click on that. And one of the actions I like to use is this one called the compose action. So the compose action here is in the data operations connector. And there it is there, compose. And for those of you who've done, old school development, this is like, or even just console apps in .NET, this is like the console write line equivalent in Flow. It just allows you to output a value so you can just make sure that things are working the way you expected. Okay, so triggers and certain actions, actually most actions, expose what are called output or dynamic content. So when the trigger runs here, it's going to expose some data about the item that was created. And then I can use that in later actions. So over here in my compose action, I can say, what do I want? What information from the trigger do I want to gather? Okay. So I do that by clicking on inputs. And now I have dynamic content. So you can see here in the dynamic content, it says this content below here is from the trigger, right? And then what data is available from the trigger? There's list of items, created by, modified by, and so on. Well, for right now, what I want is the title. So all list items have a title. So we'll scroll down here to the bottom. Sorry, not to the bottom. Where is it? Did I go too far? Oh, there it is, there. Okay, usually it's near the bottom. All right, so there's our title property. So with the trigger added and the one action added, I can now save. And I can save by clicking the icon here in the top right, or by clicking this button right here. So I'll just go ahead and click the button. And then over here in the top left, you'll see, you can see that it said saved or saving or saved right here beside the name of the flow. All right. So now that we have that, I can go ahead and run this. So by clicking this little arrow here, I can go back to the main page for the flow. Now I just saved, and I'll do it again just to prove to you, it just saved. But when I try to navigate away from the page, I get this warning saying, if you leave the page, you're going to lose your changes, even though I just saved. So the flow designer sometimes doesn't quite get that you just saved. So it puts up this warning, even though there's nothing new. So you can just go ahead and click OK here to navigate away. And this gets us to the main page for this flow. You can also get here by clicking on My Flows in the left-hand nav and then picking your flow here. Now, if the flow has multiple owners, which we may talk about a little bit later on, you might not see it here. You might have to go to Team Flows. So this is for flows with multiple owners, and this is for flows that are just you're the only owner. And again, I might talk more about that later on. If not, I'll definitely talk more about it. Excuse me, in later streams. All right, so I'll just go ahead and click on that. And then down here in the run history, we can actually see information about the runs or the instances of this particular flow. So let's go over to our list and let's add an item. So I'll go ahead and click New here. And I'll add in item 2 and then a number 100 here. And then I'll click Save. Okay. So now what we can do is go over here, and it doesn't know instantaneously that an item was added. So it's relying on what's called a webhook, which is kind of like an event notification. So we have to wait for the webhook to send the notification to Flow so that it knows, oh, okay, an item was added, I need to go and run. So we can just go ahead and refresh this page. And there you can see our flow ran 6 seconds ago. It happened very quickly. It says the duration is 0. It's not 0 seconds, but it was very quick. And it succeeded. Okay. So we can go and click on this to see the details of the flow run. So if we go to our compose action, we can see that the title of the item was item 2. So that was the title of the item. But more interestingly, we can actually click on the trigger and see the data that was sent, the inputs, which was what we configured, right? So that's the name of our site, the URL to our site and the name of the list. But more importantly, we see the outputs. Okay, so we can see here the list item ID, the title, the amount, the approval status, that's the default value of the field, who the item was created by, what's their email address. We can see some JSON down there. So we can see more information about created by. There's lots of different information that's available to us. And this information all comes through as JSON. So basically behind the scenes, all of the data that's used by Power Automate or Flow is JSON. Now, it's not always shown to you as JSON, but it underneath the scenes it is. Right? So this JSON, if you're not familiar, is JavaScript object notation. So basically, objects are enclosed in curly braces. We can see an example of that at the top there. And then there's property values. So there's properties called large, medium, and small. And then those things can have a value. So that can be something simple, like a number, a string, a date, the value null. Or it can be something complex, like an array or an object, and so on. Okay. So at this point, we know our trigger is working correctly, so that's good. So let's just go ahead now and let's modify our flow. So I'll click on Edit here. And what we want to do is we want to now start the approval process. So I'll click on New Step, and before I do the approval, I'm going to add in what's called the scope. So the scope is from the control connector. The scope is a container. It's just going to contain actions. And the reason why I use it is to keep the designer clean. So what I can do is I can expand or collapse a scope in the designer, and anything that's contained inside the scope then gets expanded or collapsed because of the container being expanded or collapsed. So it just enables me to have a very clean design experience. And the more complex the flows you build, the designer will get sort of unruly to deal with. You'll be doing a lot of scrolling both horizontally and vertically. So the more you can use containers like scopes to contain actions, the easier it's going to be for you to be able to navigate around your flows. So inside the flow, I'll click the Add an Action button. And here I want to use an action out of the Approvals connector. Okay, so I'll type in Approval. So there's the Approvals connector. And we can see we have 3 options here. So the first and last one, create an approval and wait for an approval, are a pair. So you can create an approval that will start off the approval process. Then you can do other stuff. So you can add other actions, do other logic. And then you can add in the wait for approval action, which will then check to see, did the user or users submit approval responses? Okay. The start and wait for approval combines those 2 things together. So start and wait for an approval says, kick off the approval process and just sit there and wait for the approver or the approvers to respond. Okay, so we're going to use that in this particular example. So I'll click on that. And it's going to ask us, what's the approval type? So there's a few different options here. So the first one is the response options are approve or reject. And if you have multiple approvers, either all of them must approve, or the first one to reject will cause the approval process to end. Okay? So if I have 3 approvers, either all 3 approve or any one of them rejects. Approve, reject, first to respond is the first person who approves or the first person who rejects, that ends the approval process. Okay? And regardless, even if there's multiple approvers, that doesn't matter. Whoever does it first, that ends the process. Then you can have custom responses. So instead of just approve or reject, you could have other options. So I don't know, like going to like a message box, you could have yes, no, cancel, or whatever responses that you want. Or maybe you want approve or reject, but you also want some other option as well, right? Just reject last. So if you have a multi-stage approval, instead of rejecting the whole process, you just reject the last, so it goes back to the previous approver or whatever you want. Now, it's important to note that these last 2 are premium features. Okay, so if you want to use custom responses, that is a premium feature, which means that the author of the flow needs to have a premium license. And again, depending on a very complex set of rules, the consumers of this flow may also need to have premium flow licenses. Okay, so we're going to keep it simple. We're just going to go with approve or reject, everyone must approve. And once I make that choice, then the rest of the options for the approval, for the start and wait for an approval action are available to me. So the first is the title. All right, so by default, when you do this process, when an approval is started, an email is going to get sent to the user or users that you designate as the approvers. So this will be the title of the email. There's also a couple of different places where users can see the approvals that are they need to do, right? What approvals are awaiting them. So the title will also identify the actual approval in those other places, and I'll show you an example of that. Right. So we'll just set the title to be item review. Who is this assigned to? So I have this user over here called Adele Vance. So Adele is going to be the approver. So we can just use the people picker here to assign this to Adele. So the details are the body or the description, the body of the email that will get sent to the approver, in this case Adele, or the description of the approval that the users will see in the other places where they can approve. Okay, so you can actually add dynamic content in here. Actually, let's just go ahead and do that. Okay, so please review. And then let's just add in the title of the item. So down here in my dynamic content, we can see this is the output of the compose action, right? This action up here. And then we have when an item is created. So these are the properties down here. And if I scroll down even farther, oh, again, the title got moved. Oh, there's the title right there at the top. Okay, so please review title. So you can add in dynamic content in the title and the details and so on. So let's actually just remove that because I'm going to put the title in a different place. So I'll just change that to please review the item linked below. And in the item link, I want to put the actual link to the item in SharePoint. So the user can click on it and get to the item so they can review it. So that is the, and actually here, I'll just use this filter here. That's the link to item. And then what will be the text shown for that link? And I want the title of the item. Okay. So the user is going to see the title of the item. That will be a link that they can use to then go ahead and open the item. All right, so now we've finished configuring our start and wait for an approval action. Let's go ahead and just grab the compose here and drag and drop it below that action. And now instead of showing the title of the item that's up for approval, let's actually show information about the approval response. So now here in my dynamic content, I have available the outputs from start and wait for an approval. And I'm going to put in the response summary. So this is a summary of the information about the response, if it's a single approver, or the response is, whatever, the plural of response, if there are multiple approvers. All right, so let's go ahead and save. And let's just go back to the main page for our flow. And now instead of creating the item over here as Rob, that's me, the author, I'm going to create it as Megan. So Megan is one of the users. So Megan is here in the approval demo list. So Megan's going to go now and add an item. So she'll add item 3. And again, with an amount of $100. And then click save. Okay. So this should kick off our flow. And we said that Adele was going to be the approver. So I'm going to come over to Adele's instance of Chrome using Chrome profiles. Excuse me. And we're just going to wait for an email to show up here in Adele's mailbox, right? So when we get to the action, the start and wait for an approval action in the flow, that is going to send an email to Adele. And while I'm waiting for that, here as Adele, I'm going to open up the Flow portal. So that's flow.microsoft.com. Okay, and I'll sign in as Adele. And let's come back to Adele's email. Okay, there we go. So this is the email that got sent to Adele. And hopefully it's going to spin for a second and then show. Let's just go ahead and refresh Adele's email here. Try that again. Still got a spinny. There we go. Okay. So you can see that the email is from Microsoft Flow. There is an adaptive card here, which is from the approvals connector in Microsoft Flow, or Power Automate again. So even though the product name is Power Automate, you can still see that there are things that talk about Microsoft Flow. So it says here there was an approval requested by Rob Windsor. We'll talk about more about why it says Rob Windsor in a second. When it was created, so 6:30 p.m. GMT. And then there's the details. So that's please review. Oh, did I not change that? I thought I changed that. Let's go back to here. Oh, I guess that didn't get fixed. So it should say, please review the item linked below. We'll fix that in a second. And then there's the link to the item. So Adele can go ahead and click on that. And Adele can then see the item in the SharePoint list. So that, okay, yep, that looks good. Or that doesn't look good. So Adele can choose to approve or not approve. And then down here is where you actually do the approval. But before I get there, let's come over again to the Power Automate site. Notice that there's an indication here also that there's an approval pending. So this is in the Flow portal. And if I go to Action Items and expand that and then go to Approvals over here in the left-hand nav, Adele can see here that she has an outstanding approval. So we can see the details over here, right? So Adele can approve or reject through email. She can approve or reject here through the Flow portal. And if Adele has the Flow mobile app on her tablet or phone, she can also approve there. Right? So there's multiple options or multiple ways that you can see your approvals and then actually approve or reject, whether it's through email, the Flow portal, or the Flow mobile app. Here I'm going to use email, so I'll go ahead and approve. So I'll just click the approve button here and then click submit. And the adaptive card will then change to indicate I've completed this approval. I'll just mark this email as read. And now let's come back over to the main page for our Flow here. Oh, sorry, there was one other thing that I wanted to show you, which I messed up. But if you remember back in here, in the email, it said that the requested by was Rob Windsor. Okay. And actually, let's just do this again, just so I can show that to you. So let's go ahead, another item. Okay, so item 4 and 100, and click save. And then let's come back over here to Adele's email. Go ahead and delete this one. And generally this takes half a minute. It can sometimes take a little bit longer. There's actual sort of SLAs that Microsoft has depending on what licenses you're using. That's a combination of your Office 365 license or your Dynamics license plus any premium licenses you have for Power Automate. The combination of all of those things, again, excuse me, sort of determine what the SLAs are in terms of like how quickly or how slowly it takes to respond to actions that trigger flows. But there you can see the email again, and as I mentioned, the requested by says Rob Windsor. Okay, even though it was Megan Bowen was the person who actually requested or actually created the item that triggered the flow to run. Okay, so let's come back over here to our flow and refresh the main page. Actually, for this to fin, well, let's just click on this. You can see it says it's running, right? Because I didn't actually complete the approval process yet. So right now, we're just sitting here in a running state. So this scope is grayed because the actions within it have not been completed. So now let's go ahead and approve here. And then come back over here, and now it's finished. Right, so if we take a look at when an item was created, we should see the title is item 4. Right, so that's the approval that just happened. And then here's the approval response. So, or sorry, the response summary. So Adele was the person who approved. Her response was approve. And you can see the date and time. And this is GMT or UTC. The date and time that this actually occurred. All right. So what we want to fix, and we can fix it by clicking the little edit icon here to go into the edit mode for our flow, is the fact that the approval says it's from Rob Windsor, even though Megan Bowen was the user who created the item. So any action or trigger inside of a flow that connects to a back-end service, right? So that could be approvals, it could be SharePoint, it could be Outlook, Salesforce, whatever. It's done through what's called a connection. Okay, it's not as obvious here that this is the approvals connection, but let me just go to this one here. And you can see that the connection to SharePoint is using the credentials of Rob Windsor. So Rob at robwindsortest987.onmicrosoft.com. Okay. So for each trigger and each action that connects to a service, you indicate what credentials are going to be used to authenticate and interact with that service. Right? Well, the approvals action is connecting through the connection that I have, Rob Windsor has, with approvals. So that's the credentials it knows about. So that's why we saw Rob Windsor as the requester in the email. So some actions, like this one, for example, allows you to say, well, no, don't use those credentials, or at least indicate some other set of credentials. So in here, it's the requester. So we can indicate who is the person actually requesting the approval. And we can use the people picker as we did previously to do that. Or we can use the dynamic content. And in this case, I want to use the dynamic content. So I'll click these little arrows over here to be able to do that. And I want to indicate that the user who created the item in the SharePoint list should be the person who is indicated as the requester for the approval. Okay. So once I make that change, I can go ahead and save. And to test the work, what I could do is go add another item to the list and see if that worked. Or I can optionally instead click test up here in the top right and re-execute a previous flow run. So I can click here, use data from previous runs. Then I can choose the previous run, so I want the most recent one. And then I can click test to re-execute that flow run using the same trigger data, right? So I'm going to rerun the approval for item 4. So now over here, Adele should get an email. And notice this time that the email indicates that the approval was requested by Megan Bowen. Okay. Now, the approval connection is still indicated that it's Rob Windsor, but you can see the requester there. Okay. So now that Adele here knows, oh, okay, well, this was requested, this approval process was requested by Megan Bowen. And then the remainder of this is the same. Actually, let's fix that please review. So let me just go ahead and reject this one, just so you can see an example of a rejection. And let's come back over here and edit again. And please review the item linked below. And save. And then run another test based off of the previous test. And let's come back over to Adele here. And once the swirly stops swirling, maybe I clicked that too fast. There we go. Okay, now you can see that was fixed. Please review the item linked below. And let's go ahead and approve. All right, so let's go ahead and delete these emails. And back over here in our run history, we can see that Adele approved the most recent run. And if we go to the previous run here, we should see that we get the reject response. Okay, so right now we're at the point where the flow is triggering when an item gets created. We're going through the approval process, but we're not really doing anything with it. Excuse me. All right, so let's go ahead and edit here. Let's add a little bit more detail to this process. So to do that, I'm going to add in a couple of variables. Now, variables can't be created inside of a scope. If you try to do that, you'll get an error. So if I just click the little plus icon here, or even click add an action, either one, and then choose the variable connector, and then choose initialize a variable. You'll see it says operation initialize a variable can only be used at the top level. Okay, so let me go up here under between an item is created and the scope. I'll click the little plus icon to add an action. And again, I'll use the variable connector and initialize a variable. And this variable is going to be called approvers, and it will be a string. And I'll start out by making Adele an approver. So I'll just cheat a little bit here. Grab Adele and grab Adele's email and paste that in with a semicolon at the end. And then I'm just going to rename this to initialize approvers variable. So I can click on the menu on the top right here and choose rename. And I'll say initialize approvers variable. And now inside of our scope, I'm going to add a condition. So what we want is if the amount here is greater than 1,000, I want to add a second approver. Okay. So what I want to do is add the condition at the very top here, but the designer, for whatever reason, doesn't allow you to do that. So I'll instead add it between the start and wait for an approval action and the compose here. And the condition is in the control connector. There it is right there. And I'll set the name of the condition to if the amount is greater than $1,000. And then we'll say we want to check the value of the amount. So I'll use the filter to be able to get that from the trigger. And is the amount greater than 1,000? And if it is, then I'll have actions over here under the yes container. Okay. So I'll say here, add an action. And the action is going to be to update this variable. We're going to append to it, actually. So I'll use the variable connector. And I'm going to append to a string variable. Which variable am I going to append to? It will be the approvers variable. And what's the value I'm going to append? It is going to be Alex Wilbur's email. So I'll go ahead and just grab Alex's email and put that in there. Again, add a semicolon at the end. And then I'll just go ahead and rename this to append second approver to approvers variable. And now I've completed my condition, so I'll collapse it. And I want the condition to be above, excuse me, start and wait for an approval. So what I'll do is I'll drag this action down below here. So now we have the appropriate order. And now what I want to do is, instead of having the assign to hard-coded to Adele, I want to use that approvers variable. So again, to do that, I'll click the little arrows here. And then in my dynamic content, I'll pick the approvers variable. All right, so let's go ahead and save our work. And then come back over to Megan here. And let's add in 2 new items. So I'll add in item 5. And the amount here is 100. And save. And then I'll add in another new item. And this will be item 6. And this time the amount will be 1,500. And we'll click save. Okay. So now over here, if we monitor Adele's email, Adele should get 2 emails, one for item 5 and one for item 6. And Alex should only get an email to approve item 6, right? Because item 5, the dollar value was less than 1,000, whereas item 6, the dollar value was greater than 1,000. Okay, so here's item review for item 5. So Megan can go ahead here and approve. And then here's the item review for item 6. And again, Megan can go ahead and approve. And then over here for Alex, there should be an approval for item 6, because that's the one that had the dollar value greater than 1,000. And normally you don't see this spinny all that often. I'm not sure why there is sort of a delay here showing the adaptive card. But there we go. You can see item 6. Okay. And now Alex can go ahead and approve. And I'm going to just go ahead and mark that red. Okay, so our condition is working correctly. If we go over to the main page, we can see the run history. So this should be item 5. It is. So if we come down to our scope, we can see, is the amount greater than 1,000? No, it wasn't. So this action didn't run. So then, whoops, in our start and wait for an approval, the approvers, can you see that? Let me see if there's a way to see that. Responses, details, approval ID. No, just here in the JSON, you'll be able to see that there's the responses. It doesn't show up here, so we can just take a look at the value of the approvers variable, and we can see that it's a del here. Okay, so that was the first item, and then for the second item, which should be item 6. Item 6, amount 1,500. We can see that the amount was greater than 1,000. So Alex's email was appended to Adele's email, and then the approval went out for both of those. And we can see in the approval response summary, we can see the information about both of the approvals, the approval information for Adele and the approval information for Alex. All right, so let's go ahead and do one more approval here. So again, I'll switch back to Megan and click new, and we'll do item 7. And again, I'll set the amount at 1,500. So we have 2 approvers. And let's go over to Alex here. I can just go ahead and delete that old email. Let's do the same for Adele. And we'll just wait for that email to come in so Alex can approve. And in this case, Alex is going to reject it rather than approve. So we'll see what that effect, or the effect of that will have on the approval process. And remember, in our approval, we set the approval type to be everyone must approve. Okay. So I'll go ahead and click on this, and we'll go ahead and reject. Okay. And I'll just mark this as red. If we come over to Adele now, and Adele opens up her email, you can see that it indicates that somebody else has completed the request. Okay, so if there are multiple approvers, and you've set either first to respond, then as soon as somebody responds, all the other people will get the adaptive card changing so that they know I no longer have to do any work for this process. Or, or if somebody rejects, then there's nothing else for anybody else to do because that just automatically sets the approval as rejected. So there's nothing for Megan, nothing for Adele to do here. Okay, so if we come over to our run history and refresh, we'll see that in our main scope here, start and wait for an approval. There's the response summary. So Alex rejected. We see the same thing here in our compose that Alex rejected. And there's no response from from Adele, because Adele didn't need to respond. The approval was already rejected. All right, so now let's update the workflow so that we start to populate these fields here: approval status and approval summary. Okay, so let's go ahead and edit our workflow. And the approval summary is actually quite easy because we just get that from this action here, right? Start and wait for an approval action. So let's go ahead and just do that to start out with. So I'll click add an action, and then I want an action from the SharePoint connector. and I want an action to update an item. Okay, update an item. Note that there are two actions here. One says update, well, actually three. Update file properties, update item, and update file. Okay. Power Automate treats documents in a document library and items in a list a little bit differently, right? So if I want to update the metadata associated with a document in a document library, I use update file properties. You can use update item, but the designer works better if you use update file properties. So anything to do with lists, you're looking for something that works on items. And anything that's related to document libraries, you want to use the actions that are related to files. So when you first start using Power Automate, it's not obvious that you need to do that because, again, in SharePoint, a library is a list. You know, it just has a document. Underlying, they're all based on the same thing. But the actions that are in Power Automate work better if you, again, use the document library ones with file in the name for document libraries, and the list ones with the item in the name for lists. So we'll go ahead and choose update item here. All right, so what site does the list containing the item live in? So I'll pick that. What is the list that contains the item? I'll pick that. What item are you going to update? I specify that by the list item ID, which we can get from the trigger. So it's the same item that was given to us in the trigger. Okay. Now notice there are a couple of required fields. Title and amount are both required fields. Even though I'm not going to change the value of title or amount, I do need to specify them because they're required. It's a sort of quirk of this update item action in the designer here. So I'll just say whatever the title was in coming from the trigger, set that, and then whatever the amount was, set that. Whoops. Let me try that again. Okay, and then the approval status, I can blank that out or just leave it as pending. That's the current value, that's fine. What I want to update is the approval summary, okay? So the approval summary comes from the start and wait for an approval action. So there is start and wait for an approval, and there is the response summary. So I'll go ahead and add that in, and then I'll click save. Okay, so again, let's go back to Megan here. Let's add in a new item. This is item 8. And we'll set the amount to 1,500. And we'll click save. And then I can go ahead and delete this. And delete this. And now we'll just wait for the emails to show up in both Alex and Adele's email inbox, so that we can, we'll approve both of them in this case. And this is where some background music would be nice to fill the time where we're waiting for this. Or I could get a Stream Deck too and, you know, play the Jeopardy, you know, waiting music. It's a little advanced for right now. I'm trying to, well, I guess, I don't know, improve my stream incrementally. Maybe a Stream Deck is something I can take a look at. Anyway, so here is the email to approve. Let's go ahead and do this. This time, let's add in some comments. So these are some comments. And go ahead and submit. And then come over to, let's just mark this as red. And then come over to Adele and do the same thing. So approve, and these are some other comments. And submit. And mark that as red. And then come over here. And in a moment, our list should magically update with the value of the approval summary. Hopefully. Sometimes there's a little bit of a delay for the list to pick up the fact that the item changed below it. I don't want to have to manually refresh. I'll manually refresh if I have to, but we're just hoping that. There we go. There it is updated. So we can see Alex Wilbur approved. And actually, let's just go ahead and do this. There we go. So Alex Wilbur approved. And Adele Vance approved. There's a couple things here that could be improved upon. So one of them is the comments don't show. We can actually look at the run history, and we'll see that the comments got captured, but the automatically generated approval summary from Flow doesn't add them. And also the times they're not in my local time. So my local time currently is 3:01 Eastern, and that's showing the UTC or GMT time. Okay, so I'd like to be able to fix that. And we'll also need to update the approval status. Okay, so let's go back over to Flow here. And let's take a look at our run history. And so one of the things we could use is this outcome. So you can see that the outcome just shows the approval responses, if there's multiple, separated by a comma and a space. So I'm not going to use this in this particular example, but there is some value to that. Let's see. We should have... there's the responses. So there's the comments, right? So we can see the request date, the response date, the approver response, and then the comments. So the comments were captured. So what we want to do is, one, capture the response. So is it approved or rejected? And then two, we want to build up a better version of the response summary. But let's start out by just capturing approved or rejected. So let's go back into edit our flow here. And I'm going to create a new variable. So again, variables have to be created at the top here. So I'll initialize a variable. We'll call this variable approval response. It'll be a string. And I'm just going to default it to approved. Okay, and then I'm just going to rename this action to initialize approval response variable. Okay, so one of the pieces of output from start and wait for an approval, and we saw it just a minute ago, but I didn't highlight it. I should have. Is the collection of responses, or the array of responses. Okay, so the information about each individual response is stored in that collection or that array. So what I want to do is I want to have some code. I want to have some logic here in my flow to iterate over that array. And then in this case, just look for the approval response being reject. All right, so under start and wait for an approval, I'm going to add an action. And in the control connector, there is apply to each. There's also do until. These are both loops. We're going to use the apply to each. Okay, so what I'm going to apply to each approval response. Okay, so in the output from previous steps, it is the responses. There we go. So this is the collection here, right? So we're going to iterate over all the responses from the start and wait for an approval action. And then inside the body, what I want to do is check to see, was the response reject? And if it was, then I want to set the value of the approval response variable to rejected. Okay, so we'll go ahead and add an action here. And that's our condition action from the control connector. So rename this. So if approval response was reject. Okay, so this bit is a little bit tricky, the way this works. It's not, sorry, tricky is not the right word. Non-intuitive is a better way to describe this. So let's go ahead here and go for our dynamic content. All right, so under start and wait for an approval, we'll see responses. So this is the collection. And then the individual items inside the collection start with the word responses. So responses, comments, those are the individual response comments inside of the objects inside the collection, right? So in this case, what I want is the response. So I believe it's responses, approver response. There we go. Okay, so I'm iterating over the collection. So for each item in the collection, this property will give me the response for that item, right? So in the case of the two approvers, I'll check the first item's value, response value, and then the second time through the loop, I'll check the second user's response value. Right, so again, it's not super intuitive the way it works, but once you've done it a few times, you get used to using this. All right, so is that equal to reject? And if it is, I mentioned I want to set the value of the approval response variable to rejected. So I'll click add an action. This action is from the variable connector. It is set variable. The variable I want to set is the approval response variable, and I want to set it to rejected. Okay, and then I'll say here, set approval response variable to rejected. Okay, and then now down here in our update item, we'll now set the approval status value to the value of the approval response variable. Okay, let's go ahead and save. All right, and then back here, we'll do the same thing we did last time. Or sorry, a similar thing to we did last time. So we'll create two items. So this is approval, or sorry, item 9, value 1500. And then item 10. And a value of 1500. Okay, and now both Adele and Alex should receive 2 emails, one for item 9 and one for item 10. So what I'm going to do is for one of the items, I'm going to approve, and for the other item, I'm going to reject. So we can see both paths of that condition being exercised. And again, it might take a few seconds before our items show up. So there we go. So for item 9, I'll reject. And for item 10, I'll approve. Okay, so that was Alex. So over here for Adele, item 9 has been completed, and item 10 we're going to approve. And I'll just go ahead and clean up here. And then we'll come back over to here. Okay, so that happened faster this time. So there is item 9. It was rejected. So we can see that the approval status got set to rejected. And there is our approval summary. And then for item 10, that one was approved. And then there is our approval summary. Okay, so our condition is working as expected. If the items are approved, the approval status gets set to approved. If it was rejected, it gets set to rejected. And actually, for that particular condition, we actually could have used the output instead of having to loop over the items. But I want to loop over the responses. But I want to loop over the responses anyway. So it just made sense to do it that way. All right. So the last thing I want to do, actually, before I get to that, let's take a look at this, because this is important too. Notice that the modified by is Rob Windsor, right? So even though Megan was the user who created the item, even though we indicated Megan was the user requesting the approval, and even though Adele and Alex are the people doing the approvals, the modified by still gets identified by or as Rob Windsor. And this comes back to something we've already discussed, which is connections. So here in my update item action, the connection I'm using is Rob Windsor. Right down here. Whoops. That is not the shape that I wanted to draw. I wanted to draw this shape. Okay. So I am connecting to SharePoint as Rob Windsor. When I do the update on the list item, those are the credentials that are being used. So those are the credentials that get shown as the modified by. Now, if I wanted to connect as a different user, I could click Add New Connection, and I can sign in as another user. And then the modified by would show as that user. Now, of course, I'd have to have their credentials to be able to do that, right? Another way you can create a connection is by going over to the data option here in the left-hand nav and clicking Connections. And you can create a connection this way, right? So this will show all the existing connections. So you can see there are 3. I have connections to approvals, to Exchange Online or Outlook, Office Outlook 365, or Office 365 Outlook, and SharePoint, right? But I can create additional connections here using the new connection button up here, right? So whether you create them in the Flow Designer or here in the Connections tab, they both create a connection that is identifies the user or the credentials that are being used to connect to that backend service. Now, what a lot of organizations choose to do, is to use a service account to do that. So they'll create like a Flow service account or a Power Automate service account, or they will have multiple service accounts, maybe one for HR and one for legal, and so on. So that way, if the user who if the actions use a specific user as a connection, and for example, that user leaves the organization or whatever, and maybe you disable or delete that user account, you don't want all of your flows to stop working. So if you use a service account instead, then it's less likely you're going to disable or delete a service account. You still, of course, you still could, but generally people will think twice before doing something like that. Okay, so I'm just going to continue on the way that I showed you, but just be aware of that's why people quite often get confused. Well, why does that say Rob Windsor? It's because that is the connection. And another sort of just thing to mention here is that you don't have to always use the same credentials for all of the actions, right? So I can connect for one action as Rob Windsor. and I can connect for another action as another user, right? The connection is specific to the action or the trigger, right? So you can sort of mix and match depending on the needs of the flow. All right, so that explains that one thing. The last thing I wanted to show you was fixing the approval summary, or not fixing it. That's not the right term. Improving upon it, right? So what I want to do is I want to show the dates in Eastern time because that's where I live, and that's where my quote unquote virtual organization is based. And I also want to show the comments here in the summary. Okay. So let's go over here. Let's create another variable. So it's in the variables connector, and we'll go ahead and initialize this variable. And we'll call this response summary. And it will be a string. And it has no initial value. Okay, so down here now in our apply to each, I want to append the information about the response from the given user in the loop to the response summary. And I want it to be as close to what we saw before as possible. Okay, so add an action from the variable connector. I want to append to a string variable. There we go. So I'll just rename this, append response summary, and clearly today's spelling is hard, to response summary variable. So we're going to append to the response summary, and the value is going to be, okay, so I want the responder's name. That was first, right? Responder's name, and then the email. Actually, you want the word approver, colon. Then I want the name of the user. So this is responses approver name. Followed by a semicolon, no, comma, and then I want their email. So responses approver email, and then a new line. Okay, then we have response. So response, whoops, not there, I want that on the new line. Response. So I want responses, approver, response. Okay, then a new line. Then I want the request date. Responses, request date. And then I want the response date. Response date. I'm going to capitalize that. Okay, response is response date. And that's good for now. Okay, save. Oh, and I just saved there. So it may seem like, why did you save there? There's other work you're going to do. The more complex your flow gets, the less stable the flow designer gets. So I just have a habit of saving pretty much after every single action that I add or change. In this particular case, it's not going to make a difference because we have a very simple flow. But, I have flows that have, 100 actions or more in them. And once you get to that point and you have like depth within your logic tree, it does get quite, well, I shouldn't say quite. There are times when it becomes less than fully stable. Let's just put it that way. Okay. So now I want to check to see were there comments. So I'm going to add a condition here. And just rename this. So if the approver made comments. So I want to check to see, start and wait for an approval. So it's responses, approver, responses, comments. Okay, there we go. Is equal to, sorry, is not equal to, I'm going to check and see it's not equal to null. Actually, let's do an expression. We haven't done an expression yet. Let's go ahead and do an expression. So far, I've been using dynamic content. You can do the same thing with expressions, which use different functions that are available to you. Okay. So I'm just going to get rid of this. And I'm going to show you a way to do this that's a little bit easier with a compose action. Okay, so I'm going to add a compose action here. And I'll start it out with the same thing we had before, which was responses, comments. Okay. And then in here, in the menu, I'm going to choose peek code. So this is looking behind the scenes. So there's a function called item. So this is the function here. Let me just grab this. Called items. Okay, so the items inside the apply to each approval response, right? So that's a collection of items that we're iterating over. And it gives me the specific item. And then there's this question mark, and then comments, the word comments as a string inside of the square braces. Okay. So this says go get the comments property off of the object, the current object in our loop. Right? So the question mark there says that if any of those values doesn't exist, give me back null, the value null, or which really means nothing, right? There was no value there, right? But the comments could also come back as just an empty string, a string with no value in it, right? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to grab that items apply to each, all of this to the clipboard. And now over here, I'm going to use an expression. So the expression I want to use, or the function I want to use in here is called coalesce. So coalesce says, I'm going to give you a set of values. Give me the first value in that set that doesn't equal null. Okay. So I'm going to say coalesce, the same expression we just saw in the compose, right, which could be null, and then an empty string. Okay. So if the expression of value, the first expression, which is for the comments, evaluates to null, then it will give me the value of the second argument to coalesce, which is an empty string. If the first argument to the empty string, sorry, to the coalesce is an empty string, then it gives me that, right? So the first non-null value. So I'm either going to get back a set of comments or I'm going to get back an empty string. Okay. So sometimes it says this. The expression actually isn't invalid. I don't know. Again, it's the designer. So, oh, shoot, I wanted to change that. Let me just click on this again to edit it. If it'll let me do that. There we go. I actually wanted to have that whole thing in a length. Okay, and then end. Okay, so we want the length of the value, the result of the coalesce. Okay, so if now notice it didn't change. This is another quirk of the designer. Expressions quite often when you edit them, if you can edit them, normally there's not an issue trying to click on them to edit them. Quite often don't actually change. So let me just go ahead and cut that to the clipboard, delete the existing expression, and now change it. So length of that. Okay. All right, so if the length of that is greater than 0, okay? So if the length of the string is greater than 0, then there are comments. So then I want to append the comments to the response summary. Okay, so I don't need this compose anymore, so I can go ahead and delete it. So I'll add an action, and this will be from the variables connector. It is append to a string variable. I want to append to the response summary variable the comments. Now I want to make sure that the comments show on a separate line. So I'm just going to add in an empty line here and then say comments. And then I'm going to go get the comments, which we know should be non-empty. There we go. Okay. And I really should change the name. You should give all of your actions and triggers names that are very descriptive of what they're doing. As you start building more and more complex workflows, it's going to be very valuable to you to be able to do that, to be able to read and understand as you're going through. I'm just not going to do that for, I've shown you examples of how to do that, so I don't need to continue that process. So the very last thing I want to do is I can have multiple of these. So I'm going to add one more action, which is a variable, append a string here. I'm just going to add in a couple of blank lines. Right, so that when we do the next one, there's going to be space between the first one and the next one. And I'll go ahead and save. All right, and then for our update item, now instead of using the response summary that comes from the start and wait for an approval action, I'm going to use the response summary variable. So I'll change that and click save. All right, so now let's come back over to Megan and add 2 new items. So item 11, 1500, and item 12, 1500. Okay, and then come over to Adele's email here and wait. And again, we'll do the same thing as we did last time. We'll approve one, reject one, and we'll make sure we add comments so that we can see that the comments show up properly. So hopefully those emails will show up in a second. There's one of them. Okay, so this is for item 11. So for item 11, we'll reject. I'll put these are some comments and click submit. And for item 12, we'll approve. So these are some other comments. And then over here for Alex, we need to just do this one. And let's just not do comments for this one. And click submit. Okay. Make sure those are all marked as red. And then come over to the list. Okay, so we've made progress here. So we can see now the comments are being added. Okay, so that's good. But our dates are still being shown. Well, now it's even worse, right? Because they're being shown in a time format that's not easily readable, right? And we still got a little bit, so those spaces didn't work the way I wanted them to. You can still see that that didn't work correctly. That's a fairly easy, should be a fairly easy fix. Okay, so let's go ahead and fix the time. That's gonna be the last thing we'll do in this stream. All right, so come back over to our flow. Oh, those spaces didn't get saved, I don't think. Well, it looks like they did. 1, 2, 3. I'm appending to approval response. Oh. Response summary is what I wanted to append to. There we go. Save. All right, so here we're adding in the request date and the response date. All right, so let's go ahead and delete those. What I want to do is I want to get the request date and the response date, but converted to Eastern time. So up here, I will add an action. And I can't remember the connector name. Let's search for date. Is it under date time? Let's just check and see. Convert time zone. There we go. Okay. So what's the time to convert? So this will be, rename this, we'll call this convert request date. Date. Okay, so it's responses request date. Responses request date. The source time zone is GMT or UTC 0, which I always have trouble finding. No. I probably went, I'm sure I went past it. Yeah, there we go, UTC. The destination time zone is Eastern time. Eastern time. And the format string will be this one right here. Okay, so that is the request date. Now we need to do the same thing with the response date. So I'm going to copy and paste this. So I'll choose copy to my clipboard here. Then I'll choose add a new action. And then from my clipboard, I will choose that. Okay, we're going to rename this to convert response date. And I want to change this to responses response date. There we go. And now I'm going to use the outputs from these two actions to put the dates in. So to request date, it will be the convert request date. Converted. Okay, there's the converted time. And then this is their response converted time. And we'll click save. All right, so one last time, we'll come over here to Megan, click new, item 13, 1500, save, and then just go ahead and clean this up. So empty that. That. And then we'll wait for these emails to show up. Hopefully relatively soon. There we go. Okay, so approve These are even more comments. So Megan approved. Alex will approve. And finally, we'll come over here. And in a second, we will have the ta-da moment where all of this sort of comes together, assuming, of course, my flow doesn't fail, where we'll see the approval summary with the converted times and also that issue with the spaces fixed. There we go. All right. So, well, before you get out, you can see it's 3:36 p.m. Eastern time currently. So there is the spaces added, and there are our date and times in Eastern time with the comments. Okay. So that is pretty much, I wouldn't say it's comprehensive, but it's a relatively detailed examination of building approval workflows for SharePoint list items using Power Automate. Now, there was one thing I did mean to show you, which I forgot to do. So let's go back to my flows. And let's just click on new. And normally I just pick instant from blank and then skip and just create it all manually. So this is what I want to do here. So I want my trigger to come from SharePoint. And even though I didn't spell it correctly, that's fine. For selected item. There we go. Okay. So there you can see for selected file and for selected item. Okay. So I chose when an item is created. That means it's always going to run for every single item. The for selected file and for selected items are when a user explicitly starts the approval process. So the way you can create one of these, well, there's a couple different ways you can create one of these flows, but one of them is to go to the list and then under automate, you can choose create a flow, and you can say here on the left-hand side, start an approval when a new item is added. That's not what I want. For new SharePoint list items. No, that's not what I want. Oh, shoot. It might be. Oh, I thought there was a template here for when an item is selected or something for a selected item. I'll have to look that up, or you can just Google for it. But basically, that's the for selected item. So then, what you can do is, and let me just go ahead and close this. Then what you'll be able to do is once that flow is there, you can go ahead and select an item, and it'll show up here. The flow that's connected to the for selected item trigger will show up there, and you can go ahead and run it. Another option you can do is you can actually put a button using JSON column formatting. So a user can actually see a button or a link somewhere in the list item right here where they can click to start the flow as well. So again, I did it with the when an item is created so that it checks for all items, but you can say, no, I only want to do selected items. And maybe I'll cover building one of those approval workflows in a later stream. All right, so let's go ahead and finish up here. So I hope you found this valuable. I hope you'll be able to use this when you start building approval workflows, the information that I've shown you here. Again, what I hope to do, and what I've been doing for the last few weeks, and I hope to continue doing, is streaming regularly. Right now, the schedule is every Thursday at 2 p.m. Depending on my work schedule, what I'd really like to do is have another stream where I stream in the morning. That way, people who are not necessarily in North America can attend easier. So I might end up alternating Thursdays, have one in the afternoon, one in the morning. I haven't really decided, but for right now, I'm sticking with 2 p.m. on Thursdays. So if you want to contact me, you can contact me via Twitter. That's the easiest. My Twitter handle is in the bottom right of the screen. It's at Rob Windsor. I put the recordings of all of my Twitch streams in my YouTube channel. So you can find that just by going into YouTube and searching for Rob Windsor. This may surprise you, but I'm not the Penn State football player. I'm the other Rob Windsor. Or you can just go to my channel. I think it's youtube.com/users/Toronto Geek. Again, that link you can see in the bottom right. So again, I hope you found this stream to be valuable, and I hope to see you the next time I stream, which will probably be next Thursday. I want to start doing some impromptu streams as well. I'm going to be doing a bunch of stuff around the REST API and SharePoint that I probably won't fully do on these scheduled streams. I might just do them sort of ad hoc. So look for that as well. All right. Well, thank you again, everybody, and have a great weekend.